Chapter 20, Traitor's Family Butt. My lord, Wormtail whimpered. Are you questioning me? The deadly soft voice asked. No, my lord. Amelia Bones will be leaving her office in the next 20 minutes. I suggest you hurry. 5 minutes later, Peter was hunched at table outside of a tiny cafe just across the street from the ministry building. Bones' path to her lunch meeting should take her right past him. He hoped it did. His lord was not tolerant of failure, even failures due to uncontrollable circumstances. Bones stepped from the entrance, digging through her immense handbag. Peter forced himself to sit up, squaring his shoulders. He took a sip of his coffee, trying to appear relaxed. Heaving a gusty sigh, Bones glanced up. Once the way was clear, she began crossing the street, occasionally peering into her handbag as she continued to search. Finally, she extracted an immense hat from the bag, and, as she settled it on her head, happened to glance up and catch Peter's gaze. Her face hardening, she secured her hat and began moving purposefully through the crowd. Had he not been awaiting such a reaction, he may not have realized she was coming for him. Not bothering to pay his tab, Peter began hurrying away. Seize that man, Bones shouted. Petrificus totalis. Peter dodged, and the spell caught the boy selling copies of the Daily Prophet on the corner. Dodging down an alleyway, Peter hissed a spell that filled the alley with an oily, foul-smelling fog. Under this cover, he gratefully took refuge in his rat form and scurried into a drain, leaving the sounds of cursing and coughing behind him. Dumbledore sipped his tea and stared at the collection of pictures before him. Lily Evans, her face screwed up in comical concentration as she practiced the levitation charm. James Potter laughing as he stuck breadsticks up his nose. Severus Snape grimacing as he examined a dried toad, its desiccated foot held fastidiously between thumb and forefinger. The previous generation was arrayed above them. Juliet Evergreen next to Garrett Potter. Eileen Prince and Katerina Montclair flanking a brooding Tom Riddle. He'd managed to locate pictures of all of them in their first year at Hogwarts in the library's dusty archives. And of course, Harry, the point of the inverted pyramid he'd constructed. Dumbledore berated himself once again. How could he have failed to notice how pale, how thin, how wary the boy was? He'd known the boy's family situation wasn't ideal, of course, but he hadn't troubled himself over much about it. After all, what else was he to do? I had the same excuses when Tom Riddle kept asking to spend his summers at Hogwarts. Contrary to popular belief, Harry was no clone of James Potter. He had the messy hair and the aristocratic cheekbones, but that raven-wing black hair and the chin were certainly Severus's. He had Lily's perfect nose, which she'd gotten straight from Tom. He supposed that no one, not even he, had looked past the dark messy hair and the round glasses and the Gryffindor tie. Petunia Dursley carried the roast outside and set it on the table. Lovely, pet, Vernon said, theatrically sharpening his carving tools. Since Marge was visiting, the small family had decided to enjoy one of the last lovely evenings of summer, and eat dinner outside. So much nicer without that horrible boy, Marge said jubilantly, passing her plate to Vernon. Petunia looked at the overdone roast, mangy flower beds, and disease-riddled roses. Perhaps the boy was more useful than she'd thought. Enough of that boy, onto this delicious meal, Vernon said, forking up a bite of the dry meat. Frowning, he ladled gravy over his plate. Mum, I'm hungry, Dudley whined. She'd limited him to a slice of roast and a few small potatoes, filling most of his plate with steamed broccoli. Marge heaved several enormous slices onto Dudley's plate. Growing boy has got to eat, she said, ruffling his hair. Ignoring the affectionate gesture, Dudley began chowing through his now immense serving. But his diet, Petunia protested feebly. The two rotund siblings looked at her. Sighing, she gave up. She'd just have to take Dudley to the gym every day after Marge left. What is, boy? Marge asked. Ripper was staring towards the street, whining softly. An icy breeze blew through the garden, and the dog yelped, diving behind Marge's chair. It's cold, Dudley complained, his arms covered in goose flesh. Petunia rubbed her own pimpled arms. Nonsense, the weather's lovely, Vernon argued, though he looked a touch uneasy. That frigid wind blew again, and Ripper screamed, literally screamed, as though in agony. The massive dog fled to the opposite end of the garden, clawing madly at the wooden fence. Petunia whipped her gaze from the maddened dog, a shadow dragging at the edge of her vision. The late afternoon sunlight suddenly seemed thin and wan. Dudley, "Get in the house," she squeaked, backing that way herself, for once not arguing. Dudley ran for the house. "What's all this bother, Petunia?" Marge said. "Ripper, hush up." The dog tore aside a board and squeezed through, leaving the fence covered in bloody spittle. "It's them, Vernon," Petunia shrieked, huddled inside the doorway. "Get inside." "What are you on about?" Marge said irritably, crouching by the hole her dog had torn through the fence. "Ripper, come to Mummy, sweetums." The shadows began to thicken, looming over the obese woman as she called for her dog. "Marge, in the house!" Vernon yelled, squeezing past Petunia through the doorway. "Marge!" Petunia screamed. Marge turned, her irritated expression turning to one of horror. Her mouth stretched open in an endless, silent scream, her ruddy face blanched corpse-white. She hung suspended in an impossible position, frozen as she fell forward as though some invisible thing was holding her. Finally, the body slumped to the frozen, brittle ground, and the cold fled the garden. The ambulance had come and gone, taking Marge's body with it. They had wanted to take the Dursleys in to treat them for shock, but Petunia had adamantly refused. She had felt that things power testing the boundaries of the house. Something had denied it entrance. Lily's sacrifice, a small voice whispered. They had put Dudley to bed, and now sat huddled on their sofa, wrapped in 3 wool blankets, trying to will the shivering to stop. A long-awaited knock at the door. Clutching her blanket close, Petunia crept to the door, peering fearfully through the peephole. A familiar bearded face greeted her. "We must speak, Petunia," that gentle old voice said. Wordlessly, she opened the door. The wizard entered, his royal purple robes with their embroidered green and gold birds making her house look dull and tired. Waving his wand, Dumbledore conjured a large green chair and settled himself comfortably. Waving his wand, a silver tea service appeared. "Tea?" he offered. The 2 muggles shook their heads. The old man poured himself a cup. "Tonight you were unfortunate enough to be visited by a Dementor. These are very dark creatures that feed off of human despair. They usually guard Azkaban, our prison." "What were they doing here?" Petunia demanded. "We aren't quite certain," Dumbledore began. Vernon interrupted. "They were looking for that freak boy, weren't they?" Dumbledore, taken aback by the venom in the man's voice, blinked a bit. "We aren't certain how one slipped from Ministry control. It is possible that it was sent here to harm Harry. We simply don't know." "You said we'd be safe from your world," Petunia whispered accusingly. Dumbledore frowned at her. "Lily's sacrifice kept Harry safe, because you and your son share Lily's blood. The magic of her sacrifice was reinforced and strengthened when you gave Harry house room, but without Harry's presence." Now he gave her a cold look. "Those protections began to fail. He wasn't here long enough to renew them before he was taken." "Well, bring that brat back here, then," Vernon demanded, a note of hysteria in his voice. "I'm afraid that's not possible at this time." Dumbledore stood to go. "You can't just leave us like this," Petunia said shrilly. "I will do what I can strengthen the wards. One of our agents will be watching your home at all times. I'm afraid that's all I can offer, Mrs. Dursley. We have a war to fight, and a missing boy to find." With that, the old man vanished. The tea set and chair he'd conjured exploded in clouds of twinkly smoke that vanished before they touched the ground. Petunia found herself vaguely grateful that the smoke hadn't stained her carpet. Numb and exhausted, the pair crept into bed. Petunia fell into a restless sleep. Beautiful green eyes stared at her. A cloud of dark red hair surrounded a vague suggestion of a face. "You denied him your protection, Petunia. Now I deny you mine." "Don't, Lily, don't, please." "My boy, don't let them hurt my boy." The specter's voice was cold and pitiless, the way Lily's had never been, not even when Vernon had spat on her at their mother's funeral. "You should have thought of my boy, then, dearest sister." The voice laughed coldly. "You will need him soon, and you will be denied." As he was denied. "Lily, I'm sorry." "God, I'm so sorry." "You will be, eternally." Petunia awoke sobbing. She hid her face in Vernon's shoulder. Usually his manly scent comforted her, but tonight, he smelled of fear. "Dementors?" "How?" Sirius whispered, pale and shaking. Albus shook his head. "I have no idea." Remus asked, "Why weren't we alerted before Miss Dursley was killed?" Albus concentrated on his tea. "Fletcher," Sirius hissed, "I told you he was incompetent. God damn it, why don't you ever listen?" "Sirius, calm down," Remus soothed. gently squeezing his friend's shoulder. Sirius shook off his hand and stood. "Know what? I think I'm glad Voldemort took Harry. Merlin knows what would have happened if he hadn't." Albus rested his face in his hands as Remus followed his friend from the room. Behind his chair at the small table, waiting for Voldemort, there was one elaborate place setting for him, with 3 spoons, 4 forks, and 2 knives. As usual, the Dark Lord's place setting was limited to a single goblet. This one was beaten gold, worn smooth from use, with a vague suggestion of a wave pattern etched into the metal. Forcing himself not to fidget, Harry waited impatiently for his host to arrive. Sesfi had presented Harry with an engraved invitation to this dinner party, to which he had to properly reply. Civility was always chirping. "Practice makes perfect." Voldemort entered the room and took his seat. Harry followed suit, carefully spreading his napkin in his lap. A house elf ladled a serving of vegetable soup into Harry's bowl. Frowning, the elf added a few more carrots before backing away from the table. Harry took a precise sip and said, "It's wonderful." "Thank you," the house elf beamed. Mr. Civility had scolded him for addressing the help, so Harry took special pains to do as often as possible. To his disgruntlement, Voldemort didn't seem to notice. As the house elf was removing Harry's empty bowl, Voldemort said, "As we have discussed, you will be returning to Hogwarts on September 1st. Smiling faintly at Harry's jubilant grin, he added, "However, there are further conditions." Keeping his tone polite, Harry said, "Like what?" "Firstly, I expect you to receive at least and exceeds expectations in all of your courses. If I feel you are not fulfilling your potential, I will make other arrangements for your education." Harry nodded glumly. Maybe Hermione's homework diary would come in handy after all. "Secondly, you will wear this," the Dark Lord said, placing the ring on the table. Harry picked it up and examined it. Blooming roses, carved from bone, each held a tiny gem nestled in its center. "It's awfully girly," Harry said dubiously. "It is a potent artifact, and will provide you with certain unique protections." "Like what?" Harry asked, sliding the ring onto his right ring finger. Feeling a pinch, he pulled at it, only to find it seemingly welded to his skin. "It won't come off. Only your lawfully wedded husband can remove it," Voldemort said. "My what?" Harry yelped, yanking desperately at the ring. "One of our ancestors made it to guard his wife. He dispelled it so that no one else could remove it. Unless there is something really fucked up you're not telling me, I'm never going to have a lawfully wedded husband." "Of course not. I suppose you'll wear it for the rest of your life, then." Harry glared at him, struck speechless. On last evening of August, Harry slid his completed potions essay into his scroll case. He'd been done a week ago, but then he'd come across a few scraps of additional information he wanted to add. Hermione would be so proud, he thought, grinning. He couldn't wait to see them tomorrow. He glanced up, his good mood fading a bit. Sesfi's ears drooped sadly as she folded the clothes he'd be taking to Hogwarts. Giving him a tremulous smile, she hissed, "A section Sesfi is finding young master's jumpers, but they is old and worn out." A section. Harry's eyes filled with tears as she presented him with 3 square pillows and the remains of his first 3 Weasley jumpers. He'd worn them nearly every weekend until he'd outgrown them, not minding the growing runs or unraveling sleeves. They had been stuffed, and the arms removed and the holes knitted together. He hugged his transformed jumper from his first ever real Christmas, and gave Sesfi a tearful smile. A section. "Thank you so much." A section. The Death Eater. Harry had no idea which one. "Thanks to Voldemort's glamours," said the last of Harry's 3 shrunken trunks into his hand cart, gave Harry a polite nod, and paraded away. Harry resisted the urge to casually throw his cloak over the trunks, feeling a bit embarrassed by his good fortune. They were gorgeous, like the expensive pieces he had seen in some of Aunt Petunia's British Museum catalogues. One was black, with inlaid patterns of a silvery wood and silver fittings. One was warm shades of honey and dark brown, and one was an off-white carved with dragons, trees, and houses in an oriental style. It reminded him of the ivory Chinese puzzle balls he'd seen at a museum on a school field trip. If it hadn't been so large, he would have guessed it was ivory. He'd been informed that 2 were for clothing and the third for everything else. He'd rather wished he'd had a chance to investigate them away from Ron's jealous eyes. Harry squashed that uncharitable thought, and focused on finally seeing his friends again. Ironically, this stood a good chance of being his safest year at Hogwarts yet. He dropped his trunks off with the pile of luggage being loaded onto the baggage car, and set off to explore this corner of magical London. He'd never been to the magical side of King's Cross, except the platform itself. While the Muggle side was just a utilitarian train station, the magical side was colorful, fragrant, and exciting. Beautiful clockwork machines spat out maps if you fed them nuts, so Harry got pocket editions of Let's Go Muggle London and Must See Magical London, and a constantly updating map of London's underground and bus system. One version even gave the reader precise instructions when from the current location to the chosen destination, but frankly that struck Harry as a bit lazy. He did get the version with the "You Are Here" indicator. Magical GPS, he thought bemusedly. There were trains going to Dublin, Paris, Istanbul, New York, all over the world. The most impressive platforms had gleaming white marble arches over their entrances, each bearing the crest of Hogwarts, Buxbatons, or Durmstrang. The term trains turned out to be a misnomer, a generic term for the seemingly endless forms of transportation. Sleds pulled by reindeer, flying carpets, steamboats that puffed clouds of colorful, sweet-scented smoke. Yeah, it was amazing. While Diagon Alley was a staunchly British area, King's Cross was an international bazaar. Tiny kiosks sold magical merchandise from all over the world, thought at greatly inflated prices. However, Harry had a generous pocket full of galleons. Catching a fresh, delicious scent, he followed it, and men unloaded a crate full of pineapples, straight from Hawaii, harvested less than an hour ago. The vendor bragged. Each load of produce was brought before uniformed ministry inspectors, who cast a series of spells to eliminate any bugs or diseases. Harry laughed to himself when he spotted the enameled fruit pendants that the officials wore. Though he wasn't quite sure of the ranking system, he did figure out that more fruits meant higher rank. The stuffiest man had an apple, a pear, a banana, a plum, and a pair of cherries shining merrily from his cap. After sampling dozens of strange fruits and vegetables, and slipping bits of the best ones into his breast pocket for Newell, Harry ended up with a net bag full of fresh pineapples, muscadine grapes from the southeastern U.S., custard fruit from Thailand, and chocolate pudding fruit from Mexico. A dimpled witch smiled as she cast shrinking and preservation charms over his purchases. He finally had a chance to satisfy his pizza craving at a genuine New York pizzeria. The man behind the counter was wearing matching New York Yankees baseball cap and robes, then made his way to the express. He moved among the families, holding his head high. For the first time, he would be traveling to Hogwarts dressed like a proper young wizard, instead of a bum. Choosing, as usual, a compartment near the rear of the train, Harry settled in, trying to read his Ancient Runes book. Those wishing to test into the class were expected to sit the exam within the first 2 weeks. "Crookshanks, come back here," a familiar voice ordered. Smiling, Harry opened the door. The immense cat strode into the compartment and sniffed Harry all over, even trying to stuff his entire head into Newell's pocket. The serpent peeped irritably, and the cat gave one last sniff and retreated. Seemingly satisfied, he settled onto the velvet cloak Harry had left folded on the seat, and promptly went to sleep. "Harry!" two voices shouted together. Harry barely managed not to cry as he was wrapped in welcoming arms. Chapter 22, Sour Grapes and Sherbet Lemons. Just a note, the ring in the last chapter is not a prelude to Slash. I love a good slash fic, but this Harry is not ready for serious romance. Mum made the twins tutor me in potions. It was brilliant. We spent the whole summer making stuff for pranks. Apparently they got an investora. They're being all hush-hush about Ita, and they're gonna start a mail order service next summer. They managed to sell a few of their products to Zonkoza like these. He passed out a few rather lumpy candies. "Try one, they're great." Hermione eyed the sweet suspiciously, but Harry popped his in his mouth. Something like a cross between a sneeze and a burp filled his chest, and he opened his mouth, releasing a stream of pastel-colored bubbles. Ron reached up and popped one, which chimed a musical note. "Come on, Harry, gimme some more." Obligingly, Harry released more bubbles, and Ron managed to play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Unable to contain herself any longer, Hermione said, "We got your letter, Harry." "Are you really okay? What happened?" Ron's grin vanished, and he fidgeted with his faded red and gold tie. Harry scrubbed his palms on his expensive new trousers, avoiding his friend's gazes. "I can't tell you much besides what I put in the letter. I think he put a spell on me so I couldn't name names." "Just tell us what you can, mate," Ron said, giving Harry an awkward pat on the knee. "Well, Voldemort kidnapped me and performed this rite, and made me his heir. It left these weird marks on me." He pulled up his right sleeve, revealing the pearlescent hint of scales. Hermione stared, but Ron recoiled violently. Ashamed, Harry tried to yank his sleeve down to cover the incriminating brand, but Ron caught his wrist and pulled it close to his face, touching the edge of the mark with one blunt finger. Harry, that must have hurt," he said, horrified. "Actually, it didn't hurt at all. I just woke up, and there they were." Flashback. Hours had passed since Harry had learned of his new status as the heir of Slytherin. He was exhausted, yet so full of nervous energy. He felt slightly ill. It was well past midnight. Despite Harry's resolve to stay awake in his enemy's lair, he was becoming resigned to his temporary powerlessness. Making his decision, he grabbed a silk nightshirt from the wardrobe and shucked the fancy robe, deliberately leaving it in a crumpled heap on the floor. Struggling with the row of tiny buttons, Harry paused when he spotted something sparkling on his belly. He scrubbed at it, becoming alarmed when it only got shinier. Twisting so that the soft candlelight fell directly on his stomach, Harry peered in horror at the multicolored pattern on his stomach. Scales, he realized, his gut twisting in revulsion. "Merlin, what has he done to me?" End flashback. Ron laughed weakly, obviously relieved. "Well, they're awfully pretty, aren't they?" he teased. "I bet all of the Slytherin girls will be so jealous." He poked the mark gently. Harry laughed as well, relieved by Ron's acceptance and touched by his concern. Hermione scooted closer to Ron, bending over to examine Harry's arm. "I've never read about anything like this," she said, ghosting her fingers gently over the mark. "I had the impression that ritual magic wasn't really practiced anymore." Ron snorted. "What do you think the sorting is, Hermione?" "It's not a great rite, or anything, but it does pretty much dictate 7 years of your life." Hermione looked indignant, but Harry was impressed by Ron's insight. "I never thought about it that way, Ron." He refastened his cufflinks. "Voldemort would say that it has something to do with the dumbing down of the magical world." "What do you mean?" Hermione asked. "Well, he says," Harry said, emphasizing the he. He certainly didn't want to draw Hermione's wrath on himself, that since the Ministry was formed, a lot of magically weak people have gotten political power. "They don't understand the great magics," Harry made finger quotes, "so they persecute people who do." Apparently a bunch of restrictive laws were pushed through, disguised as being pro-Muggle and Muggle-born. Like the restrictions on animagi, Hermione had a sour expression on her face, looking for a flaw in the argument. Harry was doubly glad he'd laid that bit of philosophy at Voldemort's door. Trying to divert the impeding tirade, Harry asked, "So, what do you two do this summer?" Ron leaned forward and whispered conspiratorially, "Well, this is pretty top secret to Broken Bar." Harry nodded, and cast a few privacy charms. Hermione looked shocked. "Harry, that's Newt-level material." Shrugging, he said, "I didn't have much to do except study." "So, Ron, this summer Broken Bar?" he prodded. Ignoring Hermione's disapproval, Ron said, "Well, apparently Dumbledore formed a secret society called the Order of the Phoenix during you-know-who's first rise. He contacted the old members and recruited a bunch of new ones. I think Bill and Charlie are in it, but they won't say for sure." Ron looked a bit put out about that. "They've made Snuffle's family house into their headquarters. Creepy old dump," he added, shuddering. "We spent the whole summer cleaning it. Boggarts in closets, doxies in the curtains. It was a nightmare." "You shouldn't speak about Snuffle's home that way," Hermione scolded. "It was pretty run down, but it's actually quite an interesting old place. There was a lot of running back and forth, all sorts of people coming and going. And," she bit her lip, "the Prophet published some horrid articles about you, Harry. They're trying to convince everyone that you're crazy and dangerous." Harry grimaced. "I'm not too surprised." She nodded, lips pursed. "And if that wasn't bad enough, they've been slandering Professor Dumbledore. He's lost his chairmanship of the International Confederation of Wizards and been demoted from Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot." Shifting uneasily, Harry whispered, "I wonder if that's just fudge, or if Voldemort's behind it." Ron grunted sourly, "Could be all fudge." "Bloody moron." "Of course, Percival still thinks he farts roses." Harry barely stifled a laugh, nodding soberly as Hermione patted Ron's arm consolingly. "He'll come around, I'm sure," she said. A soft chime sounded, and Ron and Hermione stood, Straightening their robes. Prefects meeting, Ron said, beaming. He carefully fastened his badge to his uniform. We'll be back in a little while, Harry, Hermione said, closing the compartment door behind her. Severus heaved a sigh of relief as Harry stepped off of the train, flanked by the know-it-all and Weasley number 6. Both Dumbledore and the Ministry were eager to hide the truth of the Dursley woman's death, but Voldemort had known the truth of the matter within hours of the incident. He'd had horrible nightmares of his son's soulless husk staring at him. Voldemort had assured him he was taking steps. Someone had tried to condemn his heir to a fate far worse than mere death. Needless to say, the Dark Lord was not happy. Let us move forward, then, into a new era of openness, effectiveness and accountability, intent on preserving what ought to be preserved, perfecting what needs to be perfected, and pruning wherever we find practices that ought to be prohibited, said the new defense professor, Dolores Umbridge. The woman sat in her seat, daintily straightening the small black velvet bow in her hair. Harry paused in trying to blot away the stink sap staining his new robes, feeling a twist of unease in his gut as he looked at the squatty woman. This is not good, his newly cultivated suspicious side whispered. An origami mouse skittered up his leg. Harry unfolded the paper and read, "Come see me after breakfast tomorrow, apt." Harry glared after Seamus as the other boy headed off to breakfast, still steaming over the unfounded accusations. He'd hung his head in shame during his second year, but he'd be damned if he'd do it again. He opened one of his luxurious new trunks. It had a multitude of drawers, some as large, on the inside, as his old trunk, some minuscule. He randomly pulled out a few clean garments, embarrassed by this inexplicable largesse. Ron was eyeing the trunk with a touch of envy, but his remarks remained light-hearted. Serious. Harry dropped his gleaming leather book bag to the floor and flung himself into his godfather's arms. Sirius crushed him close, then thrust him at arm's length, examining him critically. "You okay, kiddo?" he said softly. Harry nodded. "I'm fine. It was a good summer," he said awkwardly. Dumbledore cleared his throat softly, and bestowed a relieved smile on Harry. "I'm glad to see you're doing well, my boy," he said. "Perhaps you could tell us about it?" Frustratingly, Harry was only able to add a few vague details to the information he'd sent out with Hedwig. He deliberately left Neville out, though. He couldn't wait to share her with Sirius, but he wasn't sure Dumbledore would understand. Meanwhile, Fawkes had been peering at him with a bright-eyed curiosity, trilling softly at him and ignoring Dumbledore's gentle admonishments for him to hush. Tired of being ignored, the great bird leapt from his perch and made himself comfortable on the arm of Harry's chair, seemingly oblivious to the small whirlwind of papers he'd left in his wake. "Hi, Fawkes," Harry said, gently petting the bird. Feeling an irritable shifting in his breast pocket, he surreptitiously cupped a hand over it, trying to hold Neville inside. Emerald Fawkes was fascinated with his jewel-like eyes. Petted him just the way he liked. Feeling a flare of infant power, he poked at the boy's chest, forcing his pointy beak between the boy's fingers. A silvery lizard thing scampered out of Emerald's false plumage and swiped at him, puffing itself up. Posturing dramatically, the lizard thing warned Fawkes away from her familiar. Fawkes sniffed haughtily, informing the lizard thing that he had seen the boy first, and thusly had dibs. The lizard thing hissed angrily. She was a rare and magnificent Quetzalcoatl, not a lizard thing. Fawkes shrugged. Whatever. She was awfully rundy, too. Had her mother rejected her from the nest, leading Emerald to take pity on her? Neville pitied Fawkes for his great ignorance. Obviously he had never seen one of her noble breed before. She had come from very far away to protect and guide this very important boy, and did not need the Ponce's help. And what was that awful smell? It smelled like someone had set fire to a chicken coop. Seeing the phoenix rear back to strike, Harry stuffed Neville back into his pocket, wincing as her tiny teeth bit his finger. "Here you go, Fawkes," he said with false heartiness, offering the bird one of the muscadine grapes he kept in another pocket to satisfy Neville's frequent hunger pangs. The magnificent bird's feathers immediately smoothed as he plucked the morsel from Harry's.